I think that it would be really helpful if we could just open up Ableton. And so I'll just show you straight up.
Cool.
Yeah, and I'll share my screen and stuff like that.
Okay, great.
Okay. So, okay. So I open up Ableton Live. Actually, oh, I've got to share my sound too. Okay, one sec. Share sound, stereo. Okay, so open up Ableton Live and it's like, whoa, what is all this stuff? This is so many different things. Okay, so the first thing that we're seeing, or the most important thing that we're seeing here that I want to clarify is that this is what's called live view. And so the idea with live view is that you can drop clips here and then you press this button and the clip plays. And so that's what makes this really good for live performance.
Okay.
And we're not going to use live view right now. Okay, so then I press tab on my keyboard. Whoops, gotta click on Ableton. I press tab and we go over to this, which is like session view, like recording session view. And
Gotcha.
this looks a lot more like Reaper, I think,
Yeah. Yeah.
except that
Yeah.
the all the things are over here. And so we've got these different tracks. These two tracks are MIDI tracks. These two tracks are audio tracks. And then we've got a lot of the same stuff that we have in Reaper for the audio tracks, where like this controls which microphone you're like this controls which microphone you're using and stuff. This zero is like the volume level, so it goes to negative infinity up to like 6 dB. You go over to zero. This is panning, and so Ableton only describes things like 50 left or 50 right instead of 100, but you
Interesting.
just multiply it by two and it's the same thing. So
Okay.
like 50 just means as far to the right as possible. And then where it starts to get a little bit different than Reaper is that you have these things called sends. And so this send, this first one here, goes over to this, which is reverb. And then this send goes over to delay. So basically you have like a separate volume knob for how much you're sending out to reverb and delay.
Gotcha.
And then if you want to put additional reverbs on individual tracks, you can also do that. But this is a way to just have like one like room reverb so that everything sounds like it's in the same room, for example. That'd be like a
Got
use
it.
of this. Yeah. Okay. So that's just like the basics of like, whoa, what's going on here? Does this make sense so far?
Yeah. Yeah. It's looking familiar, at least in
Cool.
some sense.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. So then, and like I'm gonna try to minimize the amount of like I'm just trying to show you like one thing at a time. And what I appreciate is that you're kind of following with me instead of like some people are like, wait, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? And like I'll get to all of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like if you jump like 5 steps ahead, then like I'm like, wait, but I need to explain these other things first. So yeah, yeah. So I just appreciate the way that you're just kind of like down for the ride here.
Yeah.
Okay. So um so basically, now I'm going to talk about what's going on in this part of the screen. So this is basically all like MIDI instruments and different things that you can drop into box like the MIDI boxes to get stuff to happen. And then there's some other things. There's some like effects and stuff. But yeah, so basically we've got this one tab that says drums, and these are all just different drum sounds. So you can program any of these, and it just shows you what the same beat sounds like in all these different uh drum sounds. Does that make sense?
Are these, so it says these are kits. Is this like a set of samples each
Yeah,
or?
exactly. Yeah, yeah, it's a set
Okay.
of samples. Okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah. So we're gonna work with those. I'll also show you if you click over to instruments, it's a similar thing where you've got all these different, these are like instrument libraries. Just click on the
Hmm.
first one, and then we just got,
Okay.
all these different sounds.
Yeah.
And so it's really cool. Like, I mean, I've never really gone through these in a comprehensive way, but I often use electric pianos. So just type in e piano, and then I can see the different e pianos that are in all the different sample banks.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So for now, we're going to go over to drums. Let's just use some good old 808s. Or maybe six. No, let's do 808s. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just drag and drop where it says 808s over to MIDI. And then this track is now an 808 kit.
Cool.
Okay. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on here that, to be honest with you, I don't really understand. I don't use it at all. And I'm kind of self-taught with Ableton. I'm like I'm a little over a year and a half in, and I could learn this stuff, but for me, it hasn't really been super useful. I think I've got a bunch of like Reaper brained things where there are other ways that I can do this more quickly than like learning a new interface. But I'll show you what I do.
Mhm.
Okay, so basically, what I do is I'll just hit record, and then I've got this track, this box. So what I'm going to do is just drag this box, which is right now empty, so that it's 4 measures long, just so that it's like a clear 4 measures. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. So then if I click on it, then this is where stuff gets very Ableton-y very quickly. Okay. So right now, what we're looking at in this lower part of the screen is the signal chain.
Okay.
So first we've got this, which is the instrument, and then we can drop other effects here like EQs, compressors, etc.
Mhm.
And then after that, it goes over to these effects. So, like volume, panning, sends, all that stuff. So that's what's happening here. But if I click on this other box, we get to this thing that's called the piano roll. And this is really where I work. And side comment, for other instruments, other instrument types, I know a lot more about this stuff, and I just have to do some work to learn how this works with drum kits. But that's a secondary thing. But like with a lot of
Yeah,
synths, like I'll see all the knobs here and know what they do because I have used them more.
yeah.
So anyway, okay, so we
I mean,
go over to
it's
our.
it's
Oh, go
it's
ahead. Yeah,
all envelopes at the end
yeah,
of the. I
yeah,
mean, more or less, but
yeah, totally. Okay, so now we've got our grid. We've got 4 bars, right? And it's all in the piano roll. So you
yeah.
see how it's like measure one, measure two. And then we've got our 16th notes.
Right.
And then if you want to change the grid, you just like right click or, like control click in Apple. And you can say like triplet grid. And there's all kinds of other stuff that
Huh.
you can do. But I'm just going to stick to 16th notes for now. And then you can literally just draw in a rhythm. So let's say we want bass drum hits on 1, 2, 3, 4.
Mhm.
Do you hear that?
Yeah, yeah. It's coming through.
Okay, cool. So from there, I can literally just write in, so we want hi-hats, just eighth notes. Cool. So far, is this making sense?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, cool. So then I'll just like copy paste it so that we've got 4 measures of it. Yeah, and then we can draw in a snare. Yeah, it's trying. Sometimes I just mess around with putting snares in weird places.
Mhm.
And yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. And so from there, you're really just drawing different things into a piano roll. You can also copy paste these guys instead of this if you want to just like copy paste entire patterns. And
Mhm.
that's pretty much how programming drums in Ableton goes.
Okay. Yeah, that seems not too bad for uh if you don't want. Well, yeah. I guess the part that I'm trying to figure out, which is
Mhm.
probably getting ahead of myself a little bit, is how do you make it sound a little bit more acoustic sounding, especially with like hi-hats and like things that are a little bit more
Oh,
dynamic and
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, totally. Okay. Yeah, yeah. So then we go from just like how do you use the piano roll, the drum set, into more questions
Mhm.
about like percussion and stuff. Or just like sorry, not percussion, but like production. I guess
Yeah,
the production of percussion.
indeed. Yep.
Yeah, and so there are some sounds here that just sound more like acoustic. Some of them sound more electric. So that
Okay.
that is just a thing. Like if we just drag the Corvair kit over,
Okay, gotcha. So even just like just choosing different samples will make it sound more organic or whatnot.
yeah, totally. And then additionally, what you can do is literally like you can just make your own samples if you have like a microphone and like a hi-hat or something. So you can like
Yeah.
sample your own hi-hat attacks. Or you can download a bunch of like hi-hat samples from the internet that are like actual hi-hats in actual rooms. And
Yeah, I
so
think the
yeah.
question I'm wondering is like how so you just like drew that all in. They all have the same everything. Like is in terms of like production or whatever, like is there a good way like workflow wise, how do you go in and be like, okay, I want this like this little section to be a little bit quieter, maybe add a maybe like build volume here, whatever, like
Oh
all
yeah,
the little finicky stuff
totally.
like
Okay, so
that
there,
without
yeah,
getting too crazy in the weeds.
right. Okay, so some of this is technical and some of this is artistic. And
Uh-huh.
I guess when I say things are production rather than like technical, just like knowing how Ableton works, that it's like the artistry of production. So
Mhm.
there were like in Reaper, there are a lot of different ways that you can do it. One very technical way that you can do it, which is I think something I almost never use. It's a really good way to just get totally lost. But it does exist, is just like controlling what's called velocity. So
Yeah,
on the piano roll, you'll see that each of these is set to 100. So if you want one that's quieter than
there we
another,
go.
you can
Yep.
literally just drag volume around. And so you can kind of make it sound more like a, like a sensitive human drummer who's going to play things at different dynamics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, but the danger of that, and this gets more into production than it does into Ableton, is yeah, just getting totally lost in the reeds and getting really, or lost in the weeds or whatever the phrase is, and just like getting really obsessed with how like one measure sounds. And so basically, when I'm producing, I like to work in multiple layers. And this is, I don't know if this is controversial, but it runs kind of in opposition to what some recording engineers talk about, including something that Joe says. And I think what I'm like, which I'll say in a minute, and what I'm about to say is I think actually in the long run not opposed to what Joe is saying, but it's just kind of adding another layer of nuance to it, which is that when I'm first tracking something, and this is my own production style, and the way that I work is very DAW oriented. So I build things out gradually, but step one for me is usually building a form. And so I know how the music's going to go. And the first layer of building, like a drum kit or like a drum track, like this, is that it shows me where the section transitions are, and then I can layer the other instruments over it.
Gotcha.
And then I guess there's also a question of whether you want to bring in a live drummer at some point. I have worked with a live drummer on. I worked with the live drummer for a few tracks on Torso, and he's a really good drummer. So like for him, playing to a click track was like no problem at all.
Mhm.
A lot of people say that you should track to the live drums, but I feel like if you have a drummer who has really good time and they have no problem playing to a metronome, then that point's not as important as like if you're playing with a lot of like very untrained kind of like intuitive rock musicians who only kind of know how to do their one thing but they get a specific sound. So some of it comes down
Yeah.
to like technical mastery, but
Yeah.
because I really build things in DAWs when I'm making tracks, including when I'm recording songs, I'll do this. It can be just a really rough drum part. The thing is to not get tricked into thinking that it's the final thing, and then I track other basic instrument layers that I have the whole song. And then I can listen to like a more generic version of the song. This is like it's calling it generic kind of shorthand, but basically I can listen through the whole thing. And then I'm like, okay, now I want to make this sound really good. And then this is where
Gotcha.
the thing that Joe comes up or that Joe talks about comes up, which is like committing. And so when you go to work on like actually tracking it, actually producing it, I think this is more of a production process thing than it is a yeah, than it is like a technical Ableton thing. But being like, okay, today I'm tracking acoustic guitars. I'm going to do everything that I can to record the acoustic guitars as well as possible. I'm going to perform the parts. And I think even trying to play whole takes can be really good. And then
Mhm.
afterwards, you're like, okay, those are those parts. And then you go in to like build out the next, like the bass on the track or something. But I think when you're going from the sort of just like structural component of production to like the final tracking, it's useful to be like, I am doing my best to do something that will be the final take here, you know?
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's
Yeah.
just helpful to not like if you're just setting up sort of like the scaffolding or like the foundation, not putting the pressure on it to be the final take right away because you're just like, how many measures are there till it gets to the chorus or something? And so like when
Mhm.
you're in that state, for me, it's just basically like it's like a pencil drawing before you make a painting, kind of.
Yeah, that's starting to kind of take shape as how the this process is going, and I think that that makes it a lot more approachable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Is this kind of clarifying your thoughts around drum programming?
Yeah, I think so. Part of me, so I've been in thinking about how I'm going to do this. There's like a few different ways that I have considered. One of them was actually like I have a MIDI controller that's like touch sensitive and like in some in some world when I figure out how to find the time to get it all hooked up and mapped and everything, I thought about just learning how to do some basic finger drumming, just because that way, one, it would take care of the velocity part of it, but it would also like, I feel like that's for me, that seems like a more intuitive way to like experiment with different beats and like patterns and actually like learn percussion along the same
Mm.
like at the same time.
Right. I guess I should say I have been programming drums like this for a long time. Even when I was working with sound files, 808 samples
Mm-hmm.
and Reapers, like I spent a really long time doing that. So at this
Yeah.
point, this is like pretty, this interface is pretty intuitive for me. I do think that I mean, for one thing, just programming into a piano roll is a really useful way to get to that intermediate state. I
Mm-hmm.
also wonder like if you're basically learning a new instrument, which is learning to program in drum, or learning to program in drums through like the finger drumming thing,
Mm-hmm.
like for the sake of the goal of finishing one track, it's kind of like learning a new instrument and building new types of muscle memory and stuff. And there are ways that you can do what's called quantizing, which I can actually
Mm-hmm.
just show you. Basically, what you can do is just like select things and then you right click, and then there's this button that says quantize.
Yeah.
And then you
Yeah.
can change the settings that just snaps it to the nearest like 16th note or triplet or eighth note or whatever.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that will smooth out time problems. But I feel like if you're gonna have the physical interface, um, that's a bit of a project. And I also wonder about the like, and we can talk about have using drum machines versus like a physical, like a real drummer. So I think they're both artistically valid and they play different roles or they have different sounds and stuff. But but yeah, I feel like for the goal of like March 1st, one intermediate draft,
Yeah.
I think this is a much
I
faster way to work.
I think what is clarifying in my mind is that seems like a one of those layers that is further down the line, more at the finishing stage, rather than like just getting everything scaffolded out. And that
Yeah,
this seems like this would be perfect for like just getting like the feel and the sections and all that. And
yeah,
if I want to add more like what's the word? Yeah, just like organic feel to it. Like if I because I have again this I'm starting out at at deciding which of these things I want to learn. I do have access. I do have drums. They're kind of sitting in an attic right now. But I'm trying to figure out if there's a way that I can like learn pieces of it. Like let's say just like say I do, the kick and snare programmed, but if I want to do some like fancy hi-hat work or whatever, like maybe I just mess around recording the hi-hats someday and then like do that at the end over and like play that along to like the original like bass track or whatever.
yeah. There's another thing to consider here. Yeah, and this is something that I was thinking about. Actually, I can share my Ableton screen again.
Mm-hmm.
Or I will share my Ableton screen again. Is that yeah? Like, so for one thing, you might not only want this one drum kit for your sounds,
Yeah.
and so you might want only the kick and the snare from this, but you might want other samples. And somebody who's really good at this that I've learned a lot from listening to in the last few years is Fortet. Do you know Fortet?
I don't think I've heard of that, but let me cue them up.
Yeah, he's just one person, but I'll drop his name here. But yeah, his drum production is it's amazing. I love it. And
Okay.
there's a really good podcast interview with him where they're just like having him open up different session files for different tracks that he's released, and he's breaking down how he did it. And his
Yeah.
older stuff, he's more working with samples of acoustic drums, and in the more recent stuff, he's like basically doing everything in Ableton. But he has some
Okay.
really interesting ideas. And so something you could even do is just get different hi-hat samples, and you could make the hi-hat samples yourself. But if you drag them around on a
Mm-hmm.
screen, then one of the things that you're not going to need to run into is realizing that your time as a drummer isn't where you want it to be. And I
Yeah.
think one of the real benefits to hiring a professional drummer is that they've spent, like, and I mean, when I say professional drummer, I mean, there are session people who have no personality, or there are session people who do have musical personalities. And then
Yeah.
there are really
Yeah.
badass musicians that do have real personalities. And like, I have a lot of opinions about working with bringing in other musicians to work on a project and everything. But
Yeah.
basically, like, one of the advantages that they have is just like years of working on their time. And so a way that you can kind
Mm-hmm.
of bypass that, and it gets a different sound if you're producing it in a DAW,
Mm-hmm.
is to just like have the sample and drag it around on a screen. And so you can build these layers of cymbals and hi-hats and percussion and stuff like that. And yeah, you can get your samples from elsewhere. You can record them yourself. I think something that's widespread right now in a lot of production, maybe not so much in folk music production, where I think the sound of a band in a room is still pretty central to a lot of what I know of that music. But in a lot of other types of production, pop music production, indie music production, hip hop production, some mixture of like in the box, synths and stuff like that with a lot of like live instruments is pretty common. Yeah, and I love the Fortet example because he just does it in ways that are so interesting and musical and creative and artistic.